The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the polished marble floor of the officers' dining hall at Fort Riverside, where the most powerful military leaders in Colorado had gathered for what they believed would be a routine evening banquet. The air hummed with conversation about promotions, deployments, and the kind of political maneuvering that happened when eagles and stars filled a room. Nobody paid attention to the quiet man in worn coveralls who moved methodically between the tables, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces with the invisibility that comes from being part of the background for too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. General William Harrison stood at the head table, his chest heavy with ribbons and his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. At 58, he had spent his entire adult life climbing the military hierarchy, and tonight he was celebrating his appointment as the new commanding officer of the Western Training Command. His speech was flowing smoothly until the moment that would change everything, when he gestured broadly and knocked over a full glass of red wine that splashed across the white tablecloth and began dripping onto the floor, without missing a beat. In his story about battlefield leadership, Harrison snapped his fingers at the janitor working nearby. The man in coveralls looked up, revealing weathered features and calm brown eyes that seemed to hold depths most people never bothered to notice. Harrison didn't make eye contact, treating him like a piece of equipment rather than a human being. "Clean this up immediately," he commanded, his tone suggesting that interrupting his speech for such menial concerns was beneath his dignity. The other officers chuckled, some shaking their heads at the clumsiness, others impressed by how smoothly their new commander handled the minor disruption. Robert Martinez had been working as a janitor at Fort Riverside for 3 years, and moments like this had become routine. He moved quietly to the supply closet, retrieved cleaning materials, and returned to kneel beside the general's table. As he carefully blotted the wine from the expensive carpet, Harrison continued his speech directly over him, occasionally stepping around him like he was a piece of furniture. The irony wasn't lost on Bobby, as his friends called him, that he was literally beneath the notice of a man who was expounding on the importance of recognizing excellence in the ranks. What General Harrison and every other person in that room failed to realize was that the man cleaning up their mess had once stood in a similar formal setting, but that time he had been wearing dress blues instead of coveralls, and the President of the United States had been placing the Medal of Honor around his neck for actions that had saved the lives of 23 American soldiers in a firefight that lasted 14 hours in the mountains of Afghanistan. The transformation of Robert Martinez from decorated war hero to invisible janitor hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been part of any plan he'd ever made for his life. 6 years ago, Bobby had been Staff Sergeant Martinez, a squad leader with the 82nd Airborne Division, known throughout his battalion for his ability to keep his soldiers alive in impossible situations and his unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home. His Medal of Honor citation spoke of extraordinary heroism during Operation Mountain Thunder, when his unit had been ambushed in a narrow valley and surrounded by Taliban fighters who seemed to know exactly where they would be. The battle had started at dawn when Bobby's 12-man squad was conducting a routine patrol near a village that intelligence had marked as cleared of hostile forces. The first rocket-propelled grenade had exploded 20 feet from their lead vehicle, and within seconds they were taking fire from 3 different directions. Bobby's radio operator had been hit in the first volley, and their communications equipment was destroyed, leaving them cut off from support with wounded soldiers and dwindling ammunition. For the next 14 hours, Bobby had moved between positions under constant fire, treating wounded soldiers, redistributing ammunition, and coordinating their defense with nothing but hand signals and sheer determination. When their medic was killed by a sniper, Bobby took over medical duties while still directing their tactical response. He had crawled through enemy fire 7 different times to drag wounded soldiers to safety, and when their position became untenable, he had single-handedly held off an entire enemy squad, while his remaining soldiers evacuated the wounded to a more defensible position. The citation mentioned his tactical brilliance, his medical skills, and his inspirational leadership, but it couldn't capture the weight that came afterward, the dreams that turned every night into a battlefield, and the gradual realization that the man who had been a hero for 14 hours was struggling to be himself for the remaining hours of every day that followed. The Army had offered him everything: promotion, choice assignments, a path to the highest levels of military leadership. But Bobby had discovered that heroism extracted a price that couldn't be paid with ribbons and ceremonies. After his discharge, Bobby had drifted for a while, working construction jobs and trying to find a place where his skills mattered, but the pressure didn't feel overwhelming. Fort Riverside had offered him employment as part of a veterans hiring program, and the job came with something he valued more than prestige: the ability to serve in a way that didn't require him to carry the weight of other people's lives in his hands. For 3 years, he had found peace in the simple routine of maintaining a place where soldiers trained and prepared for deployments, knowing that his work contributed to their success, even if nobody noticed his contribution. The officers' dining hall had finally quieted as the evening wound down, and Bobby was finishing his cleaning duties when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. General Harrison was speaking quietly with Colonel James Parker, the base intelligence officer, about a training exercise scheduled for the following week. Something about their tone suggested this wasn't the casual shop talk that usually filled these gatherings, and Bobby's instincts, honed by years of combat and survival, told him to pay attention. They were discussing the deployment of a company of young soldiers, many of them fresh out of basic training, to a remote training area in the Colorado mountains for what Harrison was calling an intensive leadership development exercise. The details were sparse, but Bobby caught enough fragments to understand that these soldiers would be operating without normal communication protocols and with minimal supervision, supposedly to test their ability to function independently under pressure. What troubled Bobby wasn't the training concept itself, which sounded reasonable enough, but the way Parker kept glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard, and the fact that Harrison seemed more concerned about maintaining secrecy than ensuring the soldiers' safety. Bobby had been around military planning long enough to recognize when something felt wrong, and everything about this conversation triggered alarm bells that he couldn't ignore. As he emptied the last trash can and prepared to leave for the night, Bobby caught one more fragment of conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Parker mentioned that the exercise would include Bobby's nephew Danny, a 19-year-old private who had enlisted 6 months ago and was still adapting to military life. Danny was the son of Bobby's sister Maria, and the only family Bobby had left after his parents had died in a car accident during his second deployment to Afghanistan. The kid had joined the Army partly because he looked up to his uncle's military service, though Bobby had never told him about the Medal of Honor or the circumstances that had led to his discharge. As far as Danny knew, Uncle Bobby was just a janitor who had served his country and now worked on a military base, and Bobby preferred to keep it that way. But hearing Danny's name mentioned in connection with what sounded like a questionable training exercise awakened something in Bobby that had been dormant for 3 years. The protective instinct that had once made him willing to risk everything for his soldiers. Bobby Martinez arrived at Fort Riverside the next morning at 5:30, 2 hours before his official shift began, carrying a thermos of coffee and the kind of focused energy that most people on the base had never seen from the quiet janitor. The early November air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the Colorado mountains loomed against the horizon like sleeping giants. Bobby used his master key to enter the command headquarters building, officially to begin early cleaning duties, but actually to position himself where he could observe the patterns of activity that would tell him more about the training exercise he'd overheard. For 3 years, Bobby's invisibility had been his refuge, allowing him to blend into the background and avoid the attention that had once followed him everywhere. But now that same invisibility became his greatest asset, because people talked freely around janitors in ways they never would around soldiers or officers. As he methodically cleaned the hallways and offices, Bobby listened to conversations about logistics, personnel assignments, and the kind of administrative details that revealed far more than their speakers realized. The first thing that caught his attention was a heated discussion between 2 supply sergeants about equipment requisitions that didn't match standard training protocols. They were complaining about being asked to provide cold weather gear and emergency rations for a 5-day exercise, which seemed excessive for what had been described as a leadership development program. More troubling was their mention of medical supplies that suggested someone was expecting casualties, including items typically reserved for combat situations rather than training environments. Bobby's trained eye picked up other inconsistencies as the morning progressed. The personnel roster for the exercise included soldiers from different units who had never worked together, creating a command structure that would be confused and inefficient under pressure. The selected location was a remote area of the Rockies that Bobby knew from his own training days, a region where communication equipment often failed due to terrain and weather conditions. Most concerning was the complete absence of the experienced, non-commissioned officers who would normally provide guidance and safety oversight for inexperienced troops. By mid-morning, Bobby had developed a mental picture of an exercise designed to place young soldiers in an isolated, dangerous environment without adequate support or supervision. His military experience told him that such conditions were more likely to produce casualties than effective training, and the fact that his nephew was among the selected personnel made the situation personal in a way that Bobby couldn't ignore. The protective instincts that had earned him the Medal of Honor were awakening, and he found himself analyzing the situation with the tactical mindset he thought he had left behind. The breakthrough came when Bobby was cleaning the men's room adjacent to Colonel Parker's office and overheard a phone conversation that chilled his blood. Parker was speaking to someone he addressed as Sir, discussing the exercise in terms that made it clear this was not a standard training operation. Bobby heard references to testing new interrogation techniques, evaluating psychological breaking points, and assessing the loyalty of specific personnel under extreme stress. The conversation suggested that the soldiers would be subjected to conditions designed to push them beyond their limits, with little regard for their physical or mental well-being. What made the situation even more disturbing was Parker's casual mention of plausible deniability and the importance of maintaining official distance from the exercise outcomes. Bobby's experience with military operations told him that such language was typically associated with activities that violated regulations or ethical standards, situations where commanders wanted to avoid responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. The young soldiers selected for this exercise were essentially being used as test subjects in an experiment disguised as training. Bobby's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cleaning supplies, memories flooding back of other situations where soldiers had been placed in unnecessary danger by commanders who viewed them as expendable resources rather than human beings. The rage that built in his chest was familiar, the same anger that had driven him to impossible acts of heroism when his own soldiers had been threatened by enemy fire. But this time, the threat was coming from within the military itself, from officers who should have been protecting the soldiers under their command. As the day progressed, Bobby began developing a plan of action that would have impressed his former commanding officers with its tactical sophistication and attention to detail. He used his access to various parts of the base to gather additional intelligence, piecing together a comprehensive picture of the exercise that revealed its true purpose. The soldiers weren't being trained for deployment or leadership development. They were being used as subjects in an unauthorized psychological warfare experiment that violated numerous military regulations and ethical standards. The selection criteria for the exercise participants became clearer as Bobby reviewed personnel files during his cleaning duties in the administrative offices. The chosen soldiers were either from families with limited political connections, soldiers who had previously raised concerns about military policies, or individuals like Danny whose family members might be viewed as potential whistleblowers. The exercise was designed to eliminate potential troublemakers while gathering data on psychological manipulation techniques that could be used in interrogation and control operations. Bobby realized that his nephew wasn't just in physical danger from the harsh conditions and inadequate supervision. Danny was specifically targeted because of his family connection to Bobby, who had been quietly investigating various irregularities on the base during his 3 years of employment. Bobby's military training had made him naturally observant, and he had noticed patterns of equipment disappearment, unauthorized personnel movements, and financial discrepancies that suggested corruption at high levels of the base command structure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The exercise was serving multiple purposes for Colonel Parker and his associates. It would eliminate soldiers who might pose future problems, provide cover for testing illegal interrogation techniques, and send a clear message to anyone else who might consider challenging the status quo. Bobby's nephew was being used as leverage against Bobby himself, a warning that even family members weren't safe from retaliation if he continued his unofficial investigations. Bobby's decision crystallized as he stood in the empty hallway outside Parker's office, listening to another phone conversation about the psychological profiles of the selected soldiers and the expected casualty rates for the exercise. These weren't commanders planning a training operation. These were predators selecting victims, and Bobby knew that his 3 years of peaceful invisibility were about to end. The man who had once saved 23 soldiers in 14 hours of combat was being called back to duty, whether he wanted to answer that call or not. The first step in Bobby's plan was to gather concrete evidence that would prove the illegal nature of the exercise and identify all the personnel involved in its planning and execution. His years of working as a janitor had given him detailed knowledge of the base's security systems, filing procedures, and the habits of key personnel. He knew which offices contained the most sensitive information, when they would be unoccupied, and how to access materials without triggering security protocols. Bobby spent his lunch break conducting reconnaissance of the base communication systems, identifying the frequencies and protocols used for official communications. His military training included advanced electronics and communication skills that most people on the base had forgotten he possessed. He began planning how to intercept and document the communications related to the exercise, building a case that would be strong enough to stop the operation and protect the targeted soldiers. The emotional weight of the situation was enormous for Bobby, who had spent 3 years trying to distance himself from the responsibilities and pressures of military leadership. He had chosen the janitor position specifically because it allowed him to contribute without carrying the burden of other people's lives in his hands. Now he was being forced back into a role where his decisions would determine whether young soldiers lived or died, and the familiarity of that pressure was both terrifying and strangely comforting. As the afternoon shift began, Bobby made contact with Sergeant Michael Thompson, a military police officer who had always treated him with respect and who Bobby suspected might be sympathetic to concerns about soldier welfare. Thompson was a career non-commissioned officer with 20 years of service, known throughout the base for his integrity and his protective attitude toward younger soldiers. Bobby had observed Thompson's interactions with personnel during his cleaning duties and had identified him as someone who might be willing to listen to concerns about the upcoming exercise. The conversation took place in the maintenance facility where Bobby officially worked, a location that provided privacy and plausible cover for their meeting. Bobby began carefully, testing Thompson's reactions to hypothetical questions about training safety and command accountability. Thompson's responses revealed a man who was deeply committed to soldier welfare and increasingly concerned about some of the decisions being made by the base leadership. Bobby sensed an ally, someone who might be willing to help him prevent the disaster he could see approaching. Sergeant Thompson leaned against a workbench covered with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that comes from 20 years of watching young soldiers navigate the complexities of military life. Bobby had chosen this moment carefully, waiting until the facility was empty and Thompson was conducting a routine security check that would provide legitimate cover for their conversation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed appropriate for the dark subject they were about to discuss. Bobby started with observations rather than accusations, describing patterns he had noticed during his 3 years of cleaning duties around the base. He mentioned equipment requisitions that seemed unusual for standard training exercises, conversations he had overheard about psychological testing procedures, and personnel selections that didn't follow normal protocols for leadership development programs. Thompson listened with the focused attention of an experienced non-commissioned officer, asking pointed questions that revealed his own growing suspicions about recent command decisions. The breakthrough in their conversation came when Thompson admitted that he had been receiving unusual instructions from Colonel Parker regarding the upcoming training exercise. Thompson was being ordered to reduce security patrols in the area where the exercise would take place, limiting the ability of military police to respond quickly if problems developed. He was also being told to classify any incident reports from the exercise at a security level that would prevent normal review and oversight procedures. Thompson's military experience had taught him to recognize when orders didn't align with standard safety protocols, and he had been struggling with concerns about the exercise for several days. Bobby's observations provided missing pieces of a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture of an operation designed to operate outside normal military oversight and accountability. The 2 men realized they were looking at something far more serious than training irregularities or administrative incompetence. Bobby made the decision to trust Thompson with more detailed information about what he had discovered, including the specific conversations he had overheard and the personnel files he had reviewed during his cleaning duties. Thompson's reaction confirmed Bobby's assessment of his character. Rather than expressing skepticism about the janitor's claims, Thompson treated the information with the seriousness it deserved and began asking tactical questions about how they could gather additional evidence and protect the targeted soldiers. The plan they developed required both men to use their unique positions and capabilities in ways that would maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their risk of detection. Thompson would use his official access to military police records and communication systems to document the orders he was receiving and identify other personnel who might be involved in the conspiracy. Bobby would continue his intelligence gathering through his cleaning duties, while also beginning to establish contact with the soldiers selected for the exercise. Thompson revealed additional information that made the situation even more urgent and disturbing. He had been instructed to prepare detention facilities that were supposedly needed for a classified training scenario, but the specifications included features typically associated with interrogation centers rather than standard military holding areas. The facilities were being equipped with recording equipment, soundproofing materials, and restraint systems that had no legitimate purpose in a leadership development exercise. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as Thompson shared his observations about recent changes in base operations and personnel assignments. Several experienced officers and non-commissioned officers who might have objected to questionable training procedures had been temporarily reassigned or were being excluded from activities related to the exercise. The base medical staff had received unusual instructions about reporting requirements for training injuries, essentially creating a system where serious incidents could be concealed from higher authorities. Bobby realized that the exercise was designed to serve as a testing ground for interrogation and psychological manipulation techniques that would violate numerous military regulations and international laws governing the treatment of military personnel. The young soldiers selected for participation weren't just facing dangerous training conditions. They were being subjected to experimental procedures that could cause permanent psychological damage and potentially result in serious injuries or deaths. The conversation revealed that both men had been observing concerning patterns for months, but had lacked the complete picture necessary to understand what they were witnessing. Bobby's perspective as someone with access to multiple areas of the base had allowed him to see connections that weren't visible to personnel working within specific departments or units. Thompson's position in military police had given him insight into the security and detention aspects of the operation that Bobby couldn't have discovered through his cleaning duties alone. Thompson shared intelligence about the timing and logistics of the exercise that confirmed Bobby's worst fears about its true purpose. The soldiers would be transported to the remote training area in small groups, preventing them from organizing or supporting each other if problems developed. They would be isolated from normal communication channels and subjected to increasingly stressful conditions, designed to break down their psychological defenses and evaluate their responses to various forms of coercion. The medical support arranged for the exercise was minimal and consisted primarily of personnel who were directly connected to Colonel Parker rather than the standard medical staff who would normally provide care for training exercises. Bobby's military experience told him that such arrangements were typically made when commanders expected activities that normal medical personnel might refuse to support or report through proper channels. Bobby made the difficult decision to reveal his military background to Thompson, explaining that his experience in combat operations had given him the skills necessary to recognize the true nature of the exercise and develop effective countermeasures. Thompson's reaction was respectful but not particularly surprised, as he had suspected that the quiet janitor possessed capabilities that weren't reflected in his current job description. The revelation strengthened their partnership and allowed them to plan their response with full awareness of each other's abilities and limitations. Thompson agreed to begin documenting all communications and orders related to the exercise, creating an official record that could be used as evidence if they needed to present their concerns to higher authorities. However, both men recognized that the conspiracy appeared to involve personnel at high levels of the base command structure, making it difficult to identify trustworthy channels for reporting their discoveries. They needed to develop a strategy that would protect the targeted soldiers while also building a case strong enough to ensure accountability for the personnel involved in planning the illegal operations. The urgency of their situation intensified when Thompson revealed that the exercise was scheduled to begin in 4 days, giving them a very limited window to gather additional evidence and develop effective intervention strategies. Bobby realized that his nephew Danny and the other selected soldiers were already receiving preparatory briefings that were designed to make them more vulnerable to the psychological manipulation they would face during the exercise. Bobby's plan began to take shape as he considered the resources and capabilities available to him and Thompson. His 3 years of working on the base had given him detailed knowledge of communication systems, security protocols, and personnel schedules that could be used to expose the conspiracy and protect the soldiers. Thompson's official position would provide access to records and communication channels that Bobby couldn't reach through his cleaning duties, while also offering legal authority to take certain protective actions if the situation became critical. The two men established secure communication protocols that would allow them to coordinate their activities without alerting the conspirators to their investigation. They agreed to meet daily to share intelligence and adjust their plans based on new developments, using Bobby's work schedule and Thompson's security rounds to provide cover for their meetings. The maintenance facility became their unofficial command post, a location where they could speak freely while maintaining the appearance of routine military activities. Thompson's final revelation of their initial meeting provided the most disturbing insight into the true scope of the conspiracy they were facing. He had been instructed to prepare reports that would classify the exercise participants as security risks if they failed to meet certain performance standards during the training. Such classifications would follow the soldiers throughout their military careers, potentially destroying their opportunities for advancement and making them vulnerable to additional harassment or persecution. The exercise wasn't just designed to test illegal interrogation techniques or eliminate troublesome personnel. It was creating a systematic method for identifying and neutralizing soldiers who might resist psychological manipulation or challenge questionable orders in future operations. Bobby realized that they were looking at the early stages of a program designed to transform the military into an organization that would unquestioningly follow orders regardless of their legality or morality. As their meeting concluded, Bobby and Thompson had developed a preliminary plan for gathering additional evidence while beginning to establish protective measures for the targeted soldiers. However, both men understood that they were facing an enemy that had significant resources, official authority, and the willingness to use extreme measures to protect their operations. The quiet janitor and the career military police sergeant were preparing to challenge a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of base command, and the odds against them were enormous. Bobby Martinez spent the following morning implementing the most dangerous phase of his intelligence gathering operation, using his master key access to conduct what appeared to be routine cleaning duties in Colonel Parker's private office. The space reflected the personality of its occupant, with military precision and an underlying coldness that seemed to permeate every carefully arranged item. Parker's desk was positioned to command a view of the entire room, and the walls displayed commendations and photographs that told the story of a career built on strict adherence to authority and unwavering commitment to completing assigned missions, regardless of their moral implications. The filing cabinets contained exactly the kind of documentation Bobby had hoped to find, but accessing it required skills he hadn't used since his active duty service. His military training had included basic intelligence techniques and document analysis capabilities that most people on the base had forgotten he possessed. Working with methodical efficiency, Bobby photographed key documents using a small camera concealed in his cleaning supplies, focusing on materials that revealed the true scope and purpose of the upcoming training exercise. The exercise planning documents confirmed Bobby's worst suspicions about the illegal nature of the operation, while revealing additional disturbing details about its ultimate objectives. The soldiers weren't just being used as test subjects for psychological manipulation techniques. They were being evaluated for their potential usefulness in future operations that would require unquestioning obedience to orders that might violate military regulations or international law. The exercise was designed to identify soldiers who could be trusted to follow extreme orders, while eliminating those who might resist or report illegal activities. Bobby discovered detailed psychological profiles of each selected soldier that revealed the sophisticated planning behind their selection. Danny Martinez was specifically chosen because of his family connection to Bobby, whom the planners had identified as a potential security risk due to his observational skills and combat experience. The exercise would serve multiple purposes. In Danny's case, testing his psychological resilience while also sending a clear message to Bobby about the consequences of interfering with base operations. The most chilling documents were the medical protocols established for the exercise, which included procedures for handling psychological breakdowns, physical injuries, and what were euphemistically described as training fatalities. The protocols were designed to conceal the true nature of any incidents while protecting the personnel responsible for conducting the illegal operations. Bobby realized that the planners were prepared for soldiers to be seriously injured or killed during the exercise, and they had already established systems for covering up such outcomes. Financial records revealed the funding sources for the exercise, which came from classified budgets associated with psychological warfare research and special operations development. The money trail connected the base operations to broader military research programs that were investigating the use of psychological manipulation and coercion techniques against both enemy personnel and American military members. Bobby understood that Fort Riverside was serving as a testing ground for methods that could eventually be deployed throughout the military system. Communication logs showed regular contact between Colonel Parker and personnel at other military installations, suggesting that similar operations were being conducted at multiple locations. The exercise at Fort Riverside wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic program designed to transform military culture and eliminate soldiers who might resist the implementation of increasingly authoritarian policies. Bobby realized that he and Thompson were confronting something far larger and more dangerous than a local conspiracy. The personnel files contained background investigations of the soldiers selected for the exercise that went far beyond normal military records. The investigators had compiled detailed information about family members, financial situations, personal relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the training operations. Bobby found his own file among the documents, containing surveillance reports about his activities during his 3 years of employment at Fort Riverside and assessments of his potential threat level to base security. Bobby's file revealed that his Medal of Honor service had been thoroughly investigated, and the planners understood exactly what capabilities he possessed and why he might pose a threat to their operations. They had concluded that his protective instincts and combat experience made him dangerous, but they believed that his psychological vulnerabilities and desire to avoid confrontation would prevent him from taking effective action against their plans. The assessment was thorough but ultimately wrong, as it failed to account for the depth of Bobby's commitment to protecting soldiers under his unofficial protection. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed timeline for expanding the psychological manipulation program to other military installations throughout the country. The planners viewed the Fort Riverside exercise as a proof of concept that would demonstrate the effectiveness of their methods and provide the justification for implementing similar programs on a much larger scale. Bobby realized that preventing this single exercise was crucial, not just for protecting Danny and the other selected soldiers, but for preventing the spread of illegal operations throughout the entire military system. Technical manuals revealed the specific psychological techniques that would be used during the exercise, including methods borrowed from enemy interrogation procedures and experimental research conducted on prisoners and mental patients. Techniques were designed to break down individual psychological defenses while creating dependency relationships that could be exploited to ensure compliance with future orders. Bobby's military experience told him that such methods would cause permanent psychological damage to their subjects while potentially creating soldiers who were incapable of making independent moral judgments. Bobby photographed organizational charts that revealed the full scope of personnel involved in planning and executing the exercise. The conspiracy included officers from multiple departments within Fort Riverside, as well as personnel from other military installations and civilian research facilities. The breadth of involvement explained how the planners had been able to manipulate standard military procedures while avoiding detection by normal oversight mechanisms. Equipment requisitions showed that the exercise would utilize sophisticated surveillance and recording equipment designed to monitor effect of the soldiers' responses to the psychological manipulation techniques. The recordings would be used for analysis by researchers studying the effectiveness of different coercion methods, treating the soldiers as laboratory subjects rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. Bobby understood that the soldiers Suffering would be documented and studied to improve future operations against other military personnel. The final set of documents revealed contingency plans for dealing with potential interference from personnel who might discover the true nature of the exercise. Bobby found detailed plans for discrediting, transferring, or eliminating anyone who posed a threat to the operation's success. His own name appeared on a list of individuals who were being monitored for signs of suspicious activity, and specific plans had been developed for neutralizing him if he became a problem. Bobby's discovery of the contingency plans made him realize that his investigation had placed both him and Thompson in immediate danger. The conspiracy had anticipated the possibility of discovery and had prepared methods for dealing with potential whistleblowers that included career destruction, criminal prosecution on fabricated charges, and more extreme measures if necessary. The planners viewed the exercise as too important to allow interference from individuals concerned about soldier welfare or military regulations. Medical records revealed that several soldiers who had participated in preliminary testing phases of the psychological manipulation program had suffered serious psychological damage, including complete mental breakdowns, suicide attempts, and permanent personality changes. The medical staff treating these soldiers had been threatened with prosecution if they reported the true nature of their patients' conditions, and the soldiers themselves had been classified as security risks to prevent them from revealing what had been done to them. Bobby completed his documentation of Parker's files and began planning his exit from the office when he heard voices in the hallway outside. Colonel Parker was returning earlier than expected, accompanied by General Harrison and 2 other officers, whose voices Bobby didn't recognize. The conversation was animated and concerned something urgent related to the upcoming exercise, giving Bobby crucial intelligence about timing and priorities, while also creating an immediate threat to his safety if he was discovered in the office. The voices grew louder as the group approached Parker's office, and Bobby realized that he had only seconds to conceal his presence and the evidence of his intelligence-gathering activities. His combat experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure and think clearly about available options when facing immediate danger. Bobby quickly restored Parker's files to their original positions, concealed his camera equipment, and positioned himself near the office entrance with cleaning supplies that would provide plausible explanation for his presence in the secure area. The office door opened as Bobby was wiping down the entrance area, and Colonel Parker entered with his companions, barely acknowledging the janitor's presence while continuing an intense discussion about security concerns and timeline acceleration. Bobby continued his cleaning duties while listening carefully to the conversation, which revealed that the exercise planners had detected some kind of security breach and were implementing countermeasures to protect their operation from potential interference. General Harrison's voice carried the authority of absolute command as he outlined new security protocols that would take effect immediately. The exercise timeline was being moved up by 2 days, which meant the selected soldiers would be transported to the remote training area tomorrow morning instead of the originally planned departure date. The acceleration was designed to prevent any potential interference from personnel who might have discovered information about the true nature of the operation, and Bobby realized with growing alarm that his intelligence-gathering activities might have triggered this response. Colonel Parker was expressing concerns about the readiness of their psychological manipulation protocols, arguing that the accelerated timeline would reduce the effectiveness of their testing procedures and potentially compromise the data they hoped to collect from the exercise. However, General Harrison dismissed these objections with the cold pragmatism of someone who viewed the soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving protection. The general's primary concern was maintaining operational security and preventing exposure of the illegal activities they had planned. Bobby listened with mounting horror as the conversation revealed additional details about the exercise that made its criminal nature even more apparent. The soldiers would be subjected to sleep deprivation, nutritional stress, and psychological pressure techniques that were explicitly prohibited by military regulations governing the treatment of American personnel. The procedures were borrowed directly from enemy interrogation manuals and psychological warfare, research that had been conducted on prisoners and mental patients without their knowledge or consent. The most disturbing revelation came when General Harrison discussed the expected casualty rates for the exercise, speaking about potential deaths and permanent psychological damage with the same detached tone he might use to discuss equipment losses or budget allocations. The planners had calculated that a certain percentage of the soldiers would suffer severe psychological breaks or physical injuries, and they had prepared cover stories to explain these outcomes as training accidents or pre-existing mental health conditions that had been aggravated by normal military stress. Bobby's nephew Danny was specifically mentioned in the conversation as a high priority test subject whose responses would provide valuable data about the effectiveness of family-based psychological pressure techniques. The planners intended to use Danny's concern for his uncle's safety as leverage to force compliance with increasingly extreme demands, testing how far they could push a soldier when family members were threatened. Bobby felt rage building in his chest as he realized that his own presence at Fort Riverside had made his nephew a target for these psychological predators. Colonel Parker revealed that they had been monitoring Bobby's activities for several weeks and were aware of his intelligence-gathering efforts, though they apparently underestimated both his capabilities and his determination to protect the car. Soldiers under threat. The conversation indicated that they viewed Bobby as a manageable problem that could be neutralized through intimidation or elimination if necessary, but they had not yet recognized the full scope of the threat he posed to their operations. The discussion turned to contingency plans for dealing with potential whistleblowers or personnel who might attempt to interfere with the exercise. General Harrison had authorized the use of extreme measures to protect the operation, including false criminal charges, career destruction, and more direct forms of retaliation against anyone who threatened their activities. Bobby understood that his investigation had placed both him and Sergeant Thompson in immediate mortal danger, and that the conspirators were prepared to kill to protect their illegal operations. As the conversation continued, Bobby learned that the psychological manipulation program was part of a broader initiative to identify and eliminate military personnel who might resist the implementation of increasingly authoritarian policies within the armed forces. The exercise at Fort Riverside was designed to test methods for breaking down individual moral resistance while creating soldiers who would follow orders without question, regardless of their legal or ethical implications. The planners had been working with civilian contractors who specialized in psychological warfare and behavior modification, bringing techniques developed for use against enemy personnel into applications against American soldiers. The research was being funded through classified budgets that concealed the true nature of the activities from normal oversight mechanisms, allowing the conspirators to operate without interference from personnel who might object to their methods. Bobby realized that the conversation he was witnessing represented a critical moment in the conspiracy's development, as the planners were finalizing their preparations for an operation that would serve as a proof of concept for much larger programs, targeting military personnel throughout the country. The success of the Fort Riverside exercise would provide justification for expanding similar operations to other installations, potentially affecting thousands of soldiers who would be subjected to illegal psychological manipulation and coercion. The general's final instructions to Colonel Parker included orders to accelerate the preparation of detention facilities and medical support systems that would be needed to handle the expected casualties from the exercise. The facilities were being equipped with restraint systems, surveillance equipment, and soundproofing materials that had no legitimate purpose in normal military training operations. Bobby understood that the soldiers selected for the exercise would be prisoners rather than trainees, subjected to conditions that violated every principle of military justice and human decency. As the meeting concluded and the officers prepared to leave, Bobby overheard General Harrison's instructions about maintaining communication, blackouts during the exercise that would prevent the soldiers from contacting family members or outside personnel who might interfere with the operations. The isolation protocols were designed to ensure that any casualties or psychological breaks could be concealed until cover stories could be prepared and implemented. Bobby waited until the officers had departed before completing his cleaning duties and leaving Colonel Parker's office, his mind racing with plans for preventing the disaster that was now less than 24 hours away. The accelerated timeline meant that he and Sergeant Thompson would have to implement their protective measures immediately, using whatever resources they could mobilize in the limited time remaining before the soldiers were transported to the remote training area. The magnitude of the conspiracy Bobby had uncovered was staggering in its scope and criminal in its intent, representing a fundamental betrayal of the military's obligation to protect the personnel under its command. The planners were treating American soldiers as enemy combatants, subjecting them to interrogation techniques and psychological manipulation that violated both military regulations and international law. The exercise represented a direct attack on the principles of military justice and human dignity that formed the foundation of legitimate military operations. Bobby's military training had prepared him for combat against foreign enemies, but the skills he would need to defeat this conspiracy required different capabilities and strategies. He was facing an enemy that operated within the military system itself, using official authority and legitimate procedures to conceal illegal activities. The conspirators had the advantage of position, resources, and legal authority, while Bobby had only his determination to protect the soldiers under threat and his knowledge of their criminal plans. The evidence Bobby had gathered during his investigation was comprehensive enough to expose the conspiracy and ensure prosecution of the responsible personnel, but only if he could find trustworthy channels for presenting the information without alerting the conspirators to his activities. The acceleration of the exercise timeline meant that he could not rely on normal reporting procedures or official oversight mechanisms, which might be compromised by personnel involved in the conspiracy. Bobby understood that his 3 years of invisibility as a janitor were about to end, and that his actions during the next 24 hours would determine whether Danny and the other selected soldiers would survive their ordeal or become casualties of an illegal experiment conducted by their own military commanders. The protective instincts that had earned him the Medal of Honor were fully awakened, and he was prepared to risk everything to prevent the disaster he could see approaching. The weight of responsibility Bobby felt was familiar from his combat service when the lives of his soldiers had depended on his tactical decisions and leadership capabilities. However, this situation was more complex because the enemy was operating within the military system itself, using legitimate authority to conceal illegal activities. Bobby would need to navigate military protocols and legal procedures while also implementing direct action to protect the threatened soldiers. As Bobby returned to his maintenance duties, he began implementing the emergency protocols he and Sergeant Thompson had developed for protecting the soldiers selected for the exercise. The accelerated timeline meant that they would have to take immediate action without the additional evidence gathering and preparation they had originally planned. Every hour of delay increased the danger to Danny and the other soldiers, who were already being subjected to preparatory psychological manipulation designed to make them more vulnerable to the coercion they would face during the exercise. Bobby's final preparations included securing copies of the evidence he had gathered and establishing communication channels that would allow him to coordinate with Thompson while avoiding detection by the conspirators. He also began implementing security measures to protect himself and Thompson from retaliation, understanding that their investigation had made them targets for elimination by personnel who were prepared to kill to protect their illegal operations. The transformation of Robert Martinez from invisible janitor to active protector was complete, driven by the same moral conviction that had once motivated him to risk his life saving fellow soldiers in combat. The man who had been ignored and dismissed by General Harrison and his associates was about to demonstrate the true meaning of military service, showing that the obligation to protect American soldiers transcends rank, position, and personal risk. Bobby's Medal of Honor had recognized his heroism in combat against foreign enemies, but his greatest test would come in protecting soldiers from enemies within their own military system. The conspiracy that Bobby had uncovered represented everything that was wrong with military culture when it prioritized obedience over justice and viewed soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving protection and respect. The exercise plan for Fort Riverside was designed to create soldiers who would follow any order without question, eliminating the moral judgment and independent thinking that formed the foundation of legitimate military service. Bobby's response to this conspiracy would demonstrate that true military leadership meant protecting soldiers from all enemies, including those who wore the same uniform and held positions of authority. His refusal to allow Danny and the other soldiers to be sacrificed for illegal research would prove that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost, and that the obligation to protect American lives extended to protecting them from their own commanders when those commanders had betrayed their trust and violated their oath of service. The battle lines were drawn between those who viewed soldiers as expendable test subjects and those who understood that military service was based on mutual trust and the obligation to protect personnel under command. Bobby Martinez, the quiet janitor whom General Harrison had dismissed without a second thought, was about to teach the arrogant general and his conspirators that true military honor could not be defeated by rank, authority, or institutional power. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.